wind carried knives that night. Snow fell in hard sheets, burying the open land in silence, and the moon struggled to shine through heavy clouds. Jonah Mercer leaned against the barn door, pulling his coat tighter. He had weathered many winters, but this storm carried a cruel edge. Out past the split-rail fence, he noticed movement. At first he thought it was a coyote or some lost cow, but then he saw the figure stumble, sink into the snow, and rise again. A woman. Jonah's jaw tightened. Few survived long out here without shelter, and by the way she staggered, she wouldn't last the hour. He crossed the yard quickly, boots crunching against the ice. The woman tried to straighten, her face hidden beneath a ragged scarf, her dress soaked and stiff from the cold. When he reached her, she nearly collapsed against him. "Easy," Jonah muttered, steadying her by the arms. Her skin burned with fever through the thin cloth. She lifted her eyes, pale, desperate, rimmed red from wind and tears. "Please, I just need a place to rest. Don't send me away." Jonah studied her. She couldn't weigh more than 100 pounds, and her shoes were near ruined, soles split wide. A runaway, maybe. Or worse, someone chased. He could already hear the town's whispers if he let her through his door. Folks in Dawson Ridge were sharp with their gossip, and a single rumor could sink a man's good name. But looking at her, shaking and near frozen, Jonah knew she wouldn't live another night out here. He guided her toward the cabin. "You have two choices," he said quietly. "My bed or the snow outside. I've only one blanket. Decide quickly." Her lips trembled as she glanced at the white storm swirling past. For a moment, pride flashed in her eyes, as though she wanted to say no, to keep her distance. But her knees gave out, and Jonah lifted her before she fell. Inside, the fire was nearly out. Jonah threw 2 logs on the coals until the flames caught. He laid her down on the bed, his bed, the only real comfort in the small cabin. The rough-hewn boards creaked under her light weight. "I'll take the chair," he said, pulling a wool blanket from the trunk and draping it across her. "Don't think this means anything. It's only to keep you alive." Her voice was hoarse, almost broken. I didn't come to mean anything, sir. Just warmth." "Just till morning." Jonah didn't answer. He sat near the fire, staring into the flames. He wasn't sure if she'd survive the night, but at least she wasn't alone in the snow. The storm raged until the cabin shook, but inside there was only the steady crackle of burning wood and the faint sound of her breathing. Jonah forced himself to stay awake, eyes fixed on the window, wondering who she was and what trouble might have followed her across the frozen ridge. By dawn, the snow had eased. Pale light pushed through the frosted glass. Jonah stood and stretched, stiff from sleeping upright in the chair. He turned toward the bed. She was still there, curled beneath his blanket, her face softer now in rest. For a moment he thought maybe the storm had left them behind. Then came the knock. Sharp, firm. Jonah's gut tightened. Nobody knocked that early unless it was bad news. When he opened the door, 2 neighbors stood with suspicious eyes glancing past his shoulder into the cabin. And there, behind him, was the woman in his bed. Whispers began before a word was spoken. The knock had not only brought in the morning chill, it had dragged the weight of the whole town inside. Jonah stood in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the neighbor's view as best he could. But the cabin was small, and it didn't take much for their eyes to catch the sight of a woman behind him. Sitting upright in his bed, her hair tangled, her cheeks pale from sickness. "Morning." "Mercer," said Hank Crowley, a rancher from the southern ridge. His voice carried the stiff politeness of a man who had already decided something ugly. "Didn't know you had company." The second man, Elias Dobbs, smirked. Company that stayed the night, too. Jonah's jaw tightened. She was freezing to death in the storm. "I gave her a roof. That's all." But the way Elias cocked his brow told him the explanation wouldn't matter. In Dawson Ridge, appearances carried more weight than truth. The woman, still weak, tried to rise, clutching the blanket close to her shoulders. "Please, I'll be gone today." "I didn't mean—" Her voice cracked, and Jonah stepped forward, raising his hand. "That's enough. She's under my protection, and that's all you need to know." Hank spat into the snow. Under your protection, sure. You know how the preacher will see it. You let her spend the night in your bed, Mercer. Folks will talk. They already are. Jonah's hands curled into fists at his sides. He had worked for years to keep his name clean, to build his ranch into something steady. All it took was one night, one storm, and now the town was ready to drag his honor through the mud. By noon, the whisper spread faster than the wind. At the general store, women covered their mouths, glancing at the stranger with sharp, measuring eyes. Men shook their heads, muttering about sin and schemes. When Jonah walked beside her down the main street, every step echoed like a hammer. The woman kept her eyes on the ground, shoulders hunched as though the stairs themselves weighed more than the snow she'd trudged through last night. At the church, the preacher stopped them before they could pass. Reverend Mathers was not a cruel man, but his face was carved from conviction. "Jonah," he said firmly, "this is not the way of God's people. A woman spends the night in your house in your bed. Well, you know what's said already. To mend this, only one path remains." Jonah stiffened. He knew what the preacher was about to say, but he still hoped against it. "You must marry her," Mathers finished. "At once. For her sake, for your sake, for the town's sake." The woman, Miriam, she had finally told Jonah her name, lifted her head in shock. Her lips parted, but no words came. Jonah's voice was low, rough, full of the grit of a man backed into a corner.
"You can't be serious."
"I don't even know her." "But you know the tongues of Dawson Ridge," the preacher replied gently, though his eyes held no room for debate. "If you care for your name or hers, you will stand before God and make it right." The crowd gathered around them, hungry for a verdict. Jonah could feel the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on him, daring him to defy the preacher. Miriam's voice finally broke through, soft and trembling. "I never meant for this. I never asked for this. I only needed a place to live till morning." Jonah looked at her then, really looked. She was fragile, yes, but there was a strength in the way she held herself even now, when every soul in town judged her. And Jonah knew the truth. It didn't matter what he wanted. In Dawson Ridge, the court of gossip was stronger than any judge. "Fine," Jonah said, his teeth gritted. "If it saves her from your damn whispers, I'll marry her." The crowd gasped, but the preacher only nodded, as though this was the only ending he'd ever expected. Miriam lowered her eyes, clutching her hands together. She hadn't found warmth that night. She had woken to a husband by dawn. The wedding came quickly, without flowers, without joy. The preacher spoke his words inside the cold wooden church, his voice echoing off the bare walls. Jonah stood stiff as an oak, his jaw locked. Miriam's hands trembled as she folded them together, her lips moving only enough to whisper the vows. By the time the preacher said, "Husband and wife," the church felt like a courtroom that had passed down its sentence. Outside, the townsfolk dispersed, whispering behind gloves and scarves. Some shook their heads in pity. Others smirked as though they'd uncovered a scandal too sweet to let go. Jonah walked beside Miriam in silence, his boots crunching the snow. She held her shawl tight around her, staring at the ground. When they reached the cabin, Jonah opened the door for her, but his voice was sharp. "I didn't ask for this, and neither did you. But now we're stuck with it." Miriam's face tightened, but she said nothing. She stepped inside, glancing around at the small, simple space. The bed, the chair, the hearth. It wasn't much, but it was more than the freezing roads she had walked. Jonah hung his coat and turned to her. "You keep your side of the cabin, I'll keep mine. Don't think for a second I wanted this arrangement." Her voice, though quiet, carried steel beneath it. "Do you think I wished for it either? I only wanted a night to live through. Now I'm bound to a man who looks at me like a burden." Their eyes met, his full of resentment, hers full of defiance. The air between them held more ice than the storm outside. Over the next days, life inside the cabin fell into a tense rhythm. Jonah worked the ranch, chopping wood, feeding the cattle, and mending fences. Miriam kept to the cabin, tending the fire, sewing torn cloth, boiling what little food they had left. They spoke little, only when necessary, but the town's whispers did not die down. At the general store, Jonah overheard two men muttering that Miriam had schemed her way into a good rancher's life. At the well, women whispered that her eyes were too sharp, her hands too soft, that she must be hiding something. One evening, Jonah came home with anger written all over his face. He tossed his gloves on the table. "Do you hear what they're saying? That you set this up, that you threw yourself into the snow just to trap me." Miriam rose from the hearth, her cheeks flushed from the fire. "And do you believe them?" Jonah's silence was louder than any answer. Her voice broke, though she fought to keep it steady. "You think I wanted to beg for shelter? You think I enjoy being the town's shame? I ran until my feet bled, until I could hardly stand. If you must know, I ran from a man who would have worked me to the grave." Jonah's eyes narrowed. And what man was that? But Miriam's lips pressed tight. She wasn't ready to tell him yet, not when trust between them was so thin. That night Jonah couldn't sleep. He lay on his side of the cabin, staring at the rafters, listening to the soft sound of Miriam's breathing from the bed. He wanted to believe her. Part of him did. But another part feared she carried more than frostbite into his life. Miriam, awake on the other side, stared into the fire. Her secret burned hotter than the flames. She hadn't escaped her past. It was only a matter of time before it came riding into Dawson Ridge. The snow began to thaw as winter crept toward spring, but the chill between Jonah and Miriam lingered. They lived under the same roof, yet their hearts kept their distance. Still, small changes began to show. Jonah would come in from the fields, his shoulders heavy with work, and find a hot stew waiting. Miriam would mend his shirts without asking. These were not signs of love, not yet, but the uneasy truce between them softened little by little. But outside the cabin walls, Dawson Ridge refused to forgive. One afternoon at the general store, Jonah stepped in to buy nails and flour. The room fell silent the moment he entered. A pair of women whispered near the shelves, their voices sharp as needles. "Poor fool," one muttered. "Taken in by a pretty face and a sob story," the other snorted. "Mark my words, she aimed for his bed from the start. Women like that know exactly what they're doing." Jonah's fists clenched, but he forced himself to walk past. He'd been called worse, but hearing Miriam's name twisted with lies left a bitter taste in his mouth. When he returned home, Miriam was sitting by the window, sewing with steady hands. Jonah dropped the supplies on the table. "Do you hear what they say about you?" She did not look up. "Every time I walk into town." "Then why don't you tell me the truth? Where did you come from? What you ran from?" His tone was harsh, but beneath it lay a flicker of concern he wouldn't admit. Her needle paused in mid-stitch. For a long moment she said nothing. Then in a low voice she answered, "Because the truth can cut deeper than lies. And I'm not ready for you to bleed on my account." Jonah stared at her, searching her face, but her eyes stayed fixed on the fabric, and he knew he'd get nothing more. The silence between them stretched through the evening. Days later, at the ranch, Jonah's partner Thomas rode out to meet him at the fence line. Thomas was a steady man, one who valued reputation above all. "Jonah," he began carefully, "I've heard too much talk in town. Some of our buyers are uneasy. They don't like dealing with a man whose wife carries shadows no one can name." Jonah bristled. "You think I care what gossip says?" "You should," Thomas replied. "If trade slows, you'll care soon enough. And if it gets worse, I can't tie my business to yours. Think hard about what you're risking." Jonah said nothing, but anger simmered as he rode home. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters, Miriam sat by the fire staring into the flames. Her face was pale, as though some memory gnawed at her. Finally, Jonah broke the silence. "You say nothing, and the whole town judges. I lose friends, I lose trade, and I'm left defending a woman who won't even tell me why she showed up at my door half dead." Her hands trembled in her lap. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw both fear and pride. "You think I owe you my whole story," she whispered. "But stories can ruin a person, Jonah. If I speak mine, you may hate me more than you already do." Jonah's chest tightened, though he hid it with a scowl. He had expected many things. A confession, an apology, maybe even a lie. But not this raw, trembling truth. The fire crackled between them, throwing long shadows on the walls. Neither spoke again that night. Yet deep inside, Jonah knew one thing. Whatever Miriam carried, it was close. And it was coming for both of them. Spring thawed the snow, but with the warmer winds came strangers on the road. Dawson Ridge was a small place. Every new face was noticed, every new rider questioned. One evening, as Jonah led his horse back to the barn, he saw a figure ride into town. The man was tall, dressed in a dark coat, a wide-brimmed hat shading his face. He carried himself like a soldier, but the iron at his hip and the leather pouch tied to his saddle spoke a different story. A bounty hunter. By the next morning, the whispers doubled. Folks muttered about a stranger asking questions, asking about a woman, about Miriam. Jonah heard it first at the blacksmith shop. The smith leaned close, voice low. That man, he's showing a paper with her name on it. Says she stole from her last employer. Says she ran to avoid the law. Jonah's blood ran cold. He left the shop without finishing his trade and rode hard for home. Inside the cabin, Miriam was kneading bread, her sleeves rolled, flour dusting her hands. She looked up at him, startled by the storm in his eyes. "Tell me the truth," Jonah demanded, his voice like gravel. "There's a man in town asking for you. Says you're a thief." The color drained from her face. Her hands stilled over the dough. For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Finally, she whispered, "I knew he'd send someone." Jonah's chest tightened. "So it's true? You stole?" Her eyes flashed, not with guilt, but with fury. "No, I didn't steal a thing. I worked for a man who promised wages, who bled me dry with long hours and cruel words. When I demanded pay, he turned on me. He claimed I stole silver from his house, forged my name on a warrant, and made me an outlaw in the eyes of men." Jonah studied her, searching her face for a lie. But all he found was the raw edge of someone who had run too far for too long. "You should have told me," he said. "And would you have believed me?" She shot back. The question cut deeper than either wanted to admit. That night, Jonah sat outside the cabin, staring at the horizon. He could already picture what would come: a knock at the door, a demand for Miriam, and a fight that would cost him more than his ranch. Miriam sat by the fire inside, her hands clenched tight. Every hoofbeat in the distance made her heart leap. She had survived storms, hunger, and the cruelty of men, but this was worse. This was a past she could not outrun. 2 days later, the bounty hunter rode up to the cabin. Jonah was chopping wood when the man dismounted, boots heavy on the frozen ground. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it out. "Name's Samuel Pike," the man said, voice cold and steady. "Got a warrant here for Miriam Hale, accused of theft in Carson City. I'll be taking her with me." Jonah's grip tightened on the axe handle. His voice was low, steady, but it carried a warning. "She's my wife. And she's not leaving with you." Pike smirked, his hand brushing the revolver at his side. "We'll see about that." Inside, Miriam pressed herself against the wall, listening. She knew this moment would come. The question now was whether Jonah's words meant protection, or only more trouble. The standoff outside the cabin stretched as the wind carried dust across the yard. Jonah kept both hands on the axe handle, his muscles tight as rope. Samuel Pike stood calm, hat low over his eyes, the folded warrant still dangling from one hand. "I'm not here to argue," Pike said flatly. "The law says she's wanted. My job is to take her in. You can stand aside or you can stand in the way." Jonah's voice came slow, deliberate. "And if the law's built on a lie?" Pike shrugged. "That's for a judge to decide, not you. I don't get paid to care about the truth. Only to deliver bodies." The words burned like coals in Jonah's chest. He knew bounty hunters, men who treated human lives like coins. Pike wasn't leaving empty-handed, and that meant trouble was close. Inside the cabin, Miriam pressed her back against the wall, listening to every word. She felt the old terror stirring, the memory of her master's voice, the cold weight of his lies. But another feeling pushed through it, anger. She was tired of running. Pike finally tucked the paper back into his coat. "I'll give you until tomorrow, Mercer. Hand her over then, or I'll take her myself. And trust me, you don't want to stand between me and a payday." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode toward town, dust rising in his wake. Jonah stood frozen until the hoofbeats faded. Then he stormed into the cabin. "You could have told me it was this bad," he said, slamming the axe against the wall. Miriam rose, her hands trembling. "And what good would it have done? You already doubted me. If I'd told you everything, you might have thrown me into the snow that first night." Jonah's face softened, if only a little. He hated that her words carried truth. "We've only got a day," he muttered, pacing. "If Pike rides back tomorrow, the whole town will be behind him. He'll claim to be the law, and nobody here will argue." Miriam's eyes darkened. "Then I'm doomed, no matter what." Jonah stopped and faced her. His voice was firm, not gentle, but it carried something deeper. "Not while you're under my roof. Not while you're my wife." The words settled heavily in the room. Miriam searched his face, trying to see if it was duty or care that drove him. That night, Jonah couldn't sleep. He kept his rifle across his knees, sitting by the door as the fire burned low. Miriam lay awake on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Neither spoke, but both felt the storm coming closer. By morning, Dawson Ridge was buzzing. Samuel Pike had spread the story. Miriam Hale, a thief on the run, hiding behind marriage to Jonah Mercer. Some townsfolk nodded along, saying justice must be served. Others whispered doubt, uneasy with Pike's cold smile. At the general store, Hank Crowley muttered to Thomas, "Mercer's a fool. Protecting a thief will ruin him. Best he hand her over." But Mrs. O'Leary, the storekeeper's wife, shook her head. "I've seen that girl's hands. Calloused from work. Those don't belong to a thief. Maybe the law's crooked, not her." The town was divided and the line was sharp. Back at the cabin, Miriam sat at the table, her face pale but steady. "He'll come tonight. I can feel it." Jonah checked the rifle, his jaw set like stone. "Then let him come. He'll find we don't bow to liars, no matter how shiny their badges." Miriam's eyes filled, but she blinked back the tears. For the first time since the storm, she felt the stir of something she thought she had lost. Hope. The sun slid down the ridge in streaks of red, and the cabin grew heavy with silence. Jonah checked the rifle again, setting it by the door. Miriam sat close to the fire, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Every sound outside, a horse, a branch breaking, made her flinch. As night settled, hoofbeats came steady and sure. Jonah rose, shoulders squared, and opened the door before the knock could fall. Samuel Pike sat tall in the saddle, his shadow stretching long across the snow-lit yard. Behind him trailed two townsmen, Hank Crowley and Elias Dobbs. Both carried lanterns, their faces eager as if ready to watch a spectacle. "Evening, Mercer," Pike said, his voice cold. "Time's up. Hand the girl over." Jonah planted himself in the doorway, blocking the cabin. "She's my wife." "She's not yours to take," Hank barked a laugh. "Wife or not, she's marked by the law. Don't matter how you dress it, Mercer. You're hiding a thief." Inside, Miriam stood, her chest tight. She wanted to scream the truth, to shout her innocence, but the words caught in her throat. Pike dismounted, boots crunching the frost. He pulled the warrant from his coat and thrust it forward. "Signed by a judge in Carson City. This paper says she stole silver and fled. This paper says she belongs to me." Jonah glanced at the parchment but didn't take it. His voice was steady. "Paper's easy to forge. Truth isn't." The air thickened. Elias shifted uneasily. "If it's true, let her face the court. If not, why hide her?" Jonah's eyes burned. "Because courts can be bought just like bounty hunters." Pike's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his hand brushing the revolver at his hip. "Careful, Mercer. You're one word away from standing against the law itself." Miriam's voice finally cut through, trembling but strong. "He lies. I stole nothing. I worked in that house till my hands bled. He never paid me. When I demanded it, he forged the charge. He'd see me ruined to hide his own theft." Her words fell into the night like stones into water. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the lanterns. Hank sneered. That's a tale every thief tells. But Elias's face shifted, uneasy. Still, she speaks with fire. Doesn't sound like a schemer to me. The town's division stood there in the yard, 2 men on one side, doubt growing on the other. Pike's patience snapped. He drew his revolver, leveling it at Jonah. Step aside, rancher. I'll drag her back myself. Jonah didn't move. His rifle was steady in his hands now. Barrel lifted just enough to show he was ready. His voice carried steel. You'll walk over me first. The air froze between them, sharper than any winter night. Inside the cabin, Miriam felt her knees weaken. She had seen men fight, seen blood spilled, but this was different. This fight was for her name, her life. And she knew if Jonah fell, she would be dragged back into the chains she had barely escaped. The standoff stretched. Even the horses stamped nervously as if they could feel death's shadow. Finally Pike spoke, his voice a low growl. If you choose this, Mercer, you'd best be ready to bury her with you. The law won't forget. Jonah's answer came like iron striking stone. Then let the law come. I'll face it standing, not crawling. The yard held its breath. Jonah's rifle stayed locked on Pike, and Pike's revolver stayed fixed on Jonah. Lantern light flickered across their faces, shadows stretching long in the snow. Then a voice broke the silence. Elias Dobbs stepped forward, his lantern trembling in his hand. Pike, let's not spill blood here. If she's guilty, the truth will come out. But if she's not, then you'll be the one dragging an innocent woman into chains. Pike's eyes narrowed. You doubting the law now, Dobbs? Elias swallowed hard. I'm doubting you. The law I'll honor, but I won't honor a man who carries it like a weapon for hire. Hank scoffed, spitting into the snow. Don't be a fool, Elias. That girl spun you a pretty tale. Look at Mercer, already ruined by her tricks. Jonah's voice cut sharply. She's no trickster. She's flesh and blood, and she deserves a chance to stand, not be dragged like an animal. Inside the cabin, Miriam stepped into the doorway, her face pale but her chin lifted. She clutched nothing but the shawl around her shoulders, yet her voice rang with a strength that startled even herself. Listen to me, she said. I worked in a house that broke women down. He, my master, never paid me a cent. When I demanded my wages, he forged my name on a theft. He stole, not me. That's the truth. If you'd see me chained for his lies, then you're no better than him. Her words carried across the yard. For a moment, even the horses stilled. Pike sneered, his revolver steady. Pretty speech. But speeches don't change paper. This warrant is signed. That's all that matters. Jonah took a step closer, rifle raised. Paper burns. Truth stands. Tension snapped like a taut rope. Pike's revolver shifted just slightly toward Miriam. Jonah's finger brushed the trigger. But before the shot could ring, a new voice called from the dark. Hold it! 3 townsfolk approached, lanterns swinging. Among them was Mrs. O'Leary, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. I heard every word in town about this girl, and I don't buy Pike's story. I say we hear her case before God and neighbor alike, not hand her over to a man who profits on chains. Behind her, more figures appeared. Farmers, ranch wives, young men with worry etched into their faces. The crowd had come, drawn by rumor and the promise of conflict. Now they stood in judgment. Elias raised his lantern high. Let them decide, Pike, not you. The bounty hunter's lip curled, but the sight of 20 watchful eyes unsettled him. He wasn't paid to fight whole towns. Still his pride burned. You'll regret this. Harboring a fugitive makes you all complicit. Jonah's rifle stayed steady. Then we'll be complicit together. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Agreement, courage, fear. But no one stepped aside. Not a single neighbor offered Pike support. For the first time, Miriam felt the weight in her chest ease. She wasn't standing alone anymore. Pike glared at the circle of lanterns, at Jonah's unwavering aim, at Miriam's steady gaze. Finally, he holstered his revolver, his voice dripping with fury. This isn't over. The law will come harder next time. He swung into the saddle, spurred his horse, and vanished into the dark. The crowd slowly broke apart, whispers swirling. Some still doubted, others believed, but the choice had been made for the night. Miriam would stay. Jonah lowered his rifle, the muscles in his arms trembling. Miriam looked at him, eyes shining with tears she hadn't let fall. For the first time, he didn't see her as a burden. He saw her as someone worth fighting for. The next days passed heavily with tension. Though Pike had ridden off, his words lingered like a shadow. The law will come harder next time. Jonah knew it wasn't an empty threat. Sure enough, by the week's end, a rider brought news from Carson City. A letter had been sent to Dawson Ridge, stamped with the seal of the court. Pike had stirred things quickly, claiming Miriam Hale guilty of theft, demanding her return. The preacher called for a meeting in the church. Every bench was filled that evening, lanterns glowing against the dark wood walls. Men and women sat stiffly, waiting to hear if Dawson Ridge would hand Miriam over. Jonah sat at the front, rifle laid across his knees. Miriam sat beside him, her hands clenched, her shoulders straight despite the eyes on her. Reverend Mathers raised the letter, his voice steady. The court claims Miriam Hale stole silver from her employer and fled justice. The paper is here. The seal is here. If we obey this, we hand her to the bounty man. Murmurs swept the room. Some nodded grimly, others looked doubtful. Then Mrs. O'Leary stood. Paper can be stamped. Paper can be forged. But I say a woman's life ain't worth trusting to paper alone. Jonah rose to his feet, his voice rough with anger. This paper is built on lies. I've heard her truth. She worked without pay, beaten down, cheated. Her master forged her name to cover his own theft. If this town hands her over, you'll be no better than him. The crowd stirred, but Hank Crowley leapt up, red-faced. You expect us to take your word, Mercer? For a woman who came from nowhere? What proof does she have? What proof do you have? Miriam slowly stood. Her voice shook, but she spoke anyway. I carried no proof because he left me with nothing. Only scars on my back, only nights without bread, only wages never paid. You ask me for proof? Look at my hands. She held them out, scarred, calloused, roughened by years of labor. Gasps rippled through the church. They were not the hands of a thief. Then from the back, Elias Dobbs rose. I knew her employer in Carson City. A man named Silas Kerr. He was accused before, cheating workers, skimming coins from shipments. Always wriggled free because his purse was heavy. The preacher frowned. Do you swear to this? Elias nodded. On my life. I saw his dealings with my own eyes. If silver went missing, I'd wager it never left his pockets. The church buzzed louder now, doubt tilting toward belief. At that moment, the door banged open. Samuel Pike strode in, revolver at his side, coat heavy with dust. His eyes swept the room like a hawk's. Enough talk, he barked. The court's word is final. She comes with me tonight. Jonah stepped forward, rifle in hand. His voice thundered. No, Pike, not this time. You've had your say. Now the town has theirs. The preacher looked out across the benches. People of Dawson Ridge, do we hand her over? Or do we stand against this warrant? The air was thick, every heart pounding. This was no longer just about Miriam. It was about whether the town would bow to fear or rise for truth. Lanterns flickered. Breaths caught and then voices rose. Hesitant at first. Then stronger. We stand. She stays. Not guilty. The church shook with their answer. Pike's face twisted in rage, his hand dropping to his gun. But Jonah was faster, his rifle leveled, eyes blazing. You fire that shot, Pike, Jonah growled, and you won't ride out alive. The hunter froze, surrounded by townsfolk no longer afraid. His power had cracked, and Miriam, standing beside Jonah, felt something she hadn't in years. Justice drawing near. The church was silent, except for the sound of Pike's breath, heavy with rage. His hand hovered over his revolver, but his eyes flicked across the room. Dozens of townsfolk stared back, some clutching lanterns, others with farming tools raised, a few with rifles steady at their shoulders. Jonah's rifle never wavered. You're outnumbered, Pike. Best ride before you dig your own grave. For a heartbeat, Pike seemed ready to draw. But then he saw it. Miriam's steady gaze, the town's united front, Jonah's finger firm on the trigger. The fight had drained from him, leaving only bitter defeat. With a curse under his breath, Pike shoved his revolver back into its holster. This town's sealing its own fate, he spat. You think you've beaten me, but the law doesn't forget. He turned on his heel, stormed out into the night, and mounted his horse. Hooves thundered into the darkness, fading until only silence remained. The church exhaled as one. Miriam swayed where she stood, her knees weak, but Jonah's arm caught her. He steadied her gently as though she were glass. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Reverend Mathers cleared his throat. Let it be known, Miriam Hale stands free in Dawson Ridge. Whatever papers say elsewhere, here we believe the truth. The townsfolk nodded, murmurs of agreement spreading like a warm fire through the pews. Some reached out to clasp Miriam's hand, others to clap Jonah on the back. The danger had passed, but the choice of the people had marked the night forever. Later, when the crowd had gone and only lantern light glowed in the church, Jonah and Miriam sat alone on the front bench. The silence between them was different now, soft, not heavy. Miriam's voice trembled but carried a quiet strength. You didn't have to stand for me, Jonah, not when it could have ruined you. He looked at her, his eyes shadowed yet steady. Ruined me, Miriam. I thought I was ruined before you came, living in an empty house with nothing but cattle and the cold. You gave me something worth fighting for. Her breath caught. She looked down at her hands, scarred but no longer shaking. I never meant to trap you in marriage. Jonah leaned closer, his voice low. Maybe at first we were trapped. By snow, by scandal, by what folks said. But tonight proved something. I'm not bound by gossip anymore. I'm bound because I choose it. Her eyes lifted, wet with tears. You mean, you choose me? He nodded. I do. Not because of the preacher, not because of the town. Because when I see you, Miriam, I see home. The tears slipped free, but this time they carried no shame. She reached for his hand and he took it, rough palm to rough palm. Two lives scarred but joined. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the ridge, painting the snow in gold. The storm had passed, and with it the shadows of the night. Jonah and Miriam rose together, stepping into the morning air. The cold was sharp but not cruel. For the first time it felt like a world they could face side by side, and in the glow of that dawn, the ranch no longer felt like a prison or a scandal. It felt like the beginning of a life freely chosen. If you enjoyed this tale from the frontier, don't forget to give it a like. It helps more folks discover these stories. Subscribe to Shadow Frontier Tales for more Wild West romances and frontier legends every week. And let me know in the comments what kind of story you'd like to hear next. Your words help guide the next adventure.